Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You're lucky we let you stay here after everything. She said it like a curse, like a bitter last word in a long, losing argument, even though she was the one who had started it in the first place. We were standing in the kitchen. She had her arms crossed, leaning against the counter like it was a podium, and she was about to issue a final ruling from some courtroom only she recognized. The kettle behind her was screeching like a banshee, but neither of us moved to turn it off. The moment had thickened into one of those ugly silences that you don't break, you escape from. She looked at me like she expected me to cry, or maybe apologize, or maybe pack my bags and walk out like some whipped dog. Instead, I did something I had rehearsed 100 different times in my head, but never actually had the stomach to follow through on. I pulled the folder from the drawer next to the fridge, the one with the coffee-stained handle that always stuck a little. The folder was thick and worn, but the paper inside it was crisp and clean. I slid it across the table toward her, not saying a word. She looked down, confused. Her fingers hesitated before touching it, like it might burn. When she finally opened it and saw the title on the deed, Nathaniel J. Myers, sole owner, her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. I didn't say, "I told you so," even though every part of me wanted to. I didn't yell or gloat. I just smiled, small, quiet, dangerous. And then I said, "Thank you." Not sarcastic, not loud. Just those two words. Then I walked out, left her standing there with the boiling kettle and the heavy truth, and went to my room. But that moment didn't come out of nowhere. You don't explode unless you've been simmering for a damn long time. And me? I've been simmering for over 2 decades. I was 28 when I moved back in. At first, it was supposed to be temporary. My dad, Tom, had been diagnosed with Parkinson's, and the house had gotten too much for just him and Mom. I'd just gotten laid off from a carpentry gig out in Ohio, and it made sense to come back to Connecticut for a while. I figured a few months, tops. Help around the house, help Dad get to his appointments, maybe save a little cash before heading out west again. But then a few months turned into a year. Then Dad got worse. Then Mom started acting like I was furniture that needed dusting, something in the way of her routines and her clean lines. And I didn't leave. You know, the kind of woman who organizes the spice rack alphabetically and thinks that makes her morally superior to people who don't? That's Linda. That's my mother. She's the kind of woman who makes coffee in a French press not because she likes the taste, but because it makes her feel better than people who use instant. She has a smile that can slice you in half if you're not careful and a memory like a courtroom transcript. At first, she was glad I was there, or at least she pretended to be. But that wore off fast. I wasn't her husband, and I wasn't a guest. I was a grown man taking up space, one she couldn't control completely, and that made me a threat in her house. The strange part was, back then, I still believed it was her house. I cooked. I drove Dad to physical therapy. I cleaned the gutters and paid for the new water heater when it busted in the middle of February. I did it all, and she still referred to me as just staying here for now when people asked. I remember one Thanksgiving she introduced me to her new friend from church as my son who never quite left. Said it with a laugh, like it was cute. Like I was some failure to launch, not the guy holding this place together with duct tape, spare cash, and grit. The day Dad died, I thought maybe things would shift. I thought we might become more like partners, teammates, something. But what actually happened was worse. With him gone, she grabbed at power like a drowning woman grabs at a rope. She made more decisions without asking. She started opening my mail by mistake. She tried to sell my dad's old truck, my truck now, without even telling me. Said she didn't think I needed it anymore since I wasn't working anyway. Funny how people love to remind you that you're not working when they're the reason you can't. She loved to say, "My house, my rules." Said it with the same cadence a warden might say, "Lights out." Every time she said it, I let it pass. Let her believe she had the upper hand. Let her live in that delusion because I thought it wasn't worth the fight. But really, I just didn't want to become the kind of son who throws his mother out of her home, even if it wasn't her home anymore. I used to tell myself that maybe, deep down, she appreciated what I did. That she knew I gave up more than I showed. That somewhere inside, she felt a little guilty. But the older I got, the more I realized something ugly. Some people can't be grateful because it would mean admitting they were wrong. And Linda Myers has never admitted she was wrong a day in her life. So when she finally said it, "You're lucky we let you stay here after everything," I knew we'd arrived at the end of whatever little fantasy she'd been living in. The truth was about to crash through the walls she'd built around herself. Has anyone ever made you feel like a guest in your own home? Have you ever stayed silent for years, just to keep the peace, only to realize that silence was the thing killing you the most? Tell me. I know I'm not the only one who's lived like this. I want to hear your story, too. Because mine's just getting started. My father was the kind of man who could build you a deck from scratch in a weekend, but wouldn't say more than 3 full sentences while doing it, and, even then, one of them would be something like, "Pass the wrench." Tom Myers wasn't a loud man, or a soft one either. He was made of that old-world grit that didn't teach you how to talk about your feelings, just how to swallow them without choking. He worked in heating and cooling for 38 years, retired with worn-out knees and lungs that rattled a little in winter, and never once took a sick day until the doctor told him he didn't have a choice. It was a Tuesday morning when he sat me down and said something I'd never forget, mostly because he said it like he was talking about the weather, not about death. "They say it's Parkinson's," he muttered, not looking up from the coffee he'd made too strong. "You're gonna need to take care of the house." And then after a pause, one that seemed to stretch out longer than the silence itself, he added, "I don't trust your mother with it." Now that's the kind of sentence that doesn't land right away. It hovers over your head like a low cloud until, a few days later, it starts pouring. At the time, I didn't know what he meant. Not really. I figured maybe he was just talking about bills, upkeep, the gutters I always cleaned, or the way the furnace whined when it kicked on. But now, years later, I know he meant something deeper. He wasn't just talking about responsibility. He was talking about power. And he was telling me in the only way he knew how that it didn't belong in her hands. The thing about my dad was, he saw everything. You think the quiet ones don't notice, but they do. He saw the way Mom corrected me like I was still 13. He noticed how she sighed every time I spoke. He knew she controlled every room she walked into, even if it was with a smile and a suggestion instead of a scream. My mom was never violent, never wild. She was something worse, quietly cruel. She chipped away at people instead of breaking them, and Dad, God help him, let it happen for most of their marriage because he didn't have the words or the fight to stop her. So when he changed the deed, not loudly, not with ceremony, but quietly, through a lawyer friend of his from the VFW who owed him a favor, it wasn't out of spite. It was out of protection. He didn't tell her. Didn't tell my siblings, the few cousins we still had in state, not even me at first. He just did it. And one day, when we were driving back from a neurology appointment, he told me to pull over in front of a notary's office. "I want you to sign something," he said. I remember the paper being clean, like unnaturally white, and the pen in my hand felt heavier than any hammer I'd ever swung. He slid it across the table and said, "This makes it yours when I go." Just like that. No, I love you, no, thank you, no dramatic pause. Just the facts. Just the transfer of power from a man too tired to fight to a son too scared to question. And I signed it. Because I knew deep down, even then, that it was the right thing. I also knew it was going to come back to bite me. Because Mom? She lived for control. Not money, not attention. Control. The feeling that every plate in the cabinet, every light left on, every decision about what kind of milk to buy was hers to make. Telling her the house wasn't hers anymore? That would have been like setting fire to the very ground she stood on. So I didn't tell her. I put the deed in a locked drawer in the back of my room and went on like nothing had changed. I paid the bills like usual, fixed what broke, mowed the lawn, took her grocery shopping, bit my tongue when she snapped about the thermostat being too high or the dishes being put away wrong. And every time she threw that line at me, my house, my rules, I nodded like a goddamn idiot and went back to biting down the truth. You ever keep a secret so long it starts to feel like a disease? Not something you're protecting, but something rotting inside of you? That's what this became. A deed signed in silence, growing like mold under the floorboards. I'd tell myself I was doing it for her, or maybe for Dad, keeping things calm, keeping the peace, not rocking the boat in the middle of a storm. But the truth is, I think I was doing it for me too. Because part of me wanted her to figure it out. Part of me wanted her to keep poking, keep pushing, until one day she finally pushed too hard. I wanted her to beg for the truth just so I could give it to her. But the funny thing is, people like my mom don't beg. They demand. They assume. They build entire lives on the idea that they're owed something. And the longer you let them think it, the worse the explosion is when the truth finally shows up. So I waited. And she kept walking through that house like it was her kingdom, and I was some useless court jester. Until one day, she crossed a line so sharp it finally cut through the silence. And that's when the deed came out of the drawer. But that part's still coming. First, you need to understand how bad it got, how hard she worked to rewrite reality, how deep her need for ownership went, and how much of myself I had to bury to let her keep thinking she was in charge. Because once the truth was out, there was no going back. And in this house, going back was the only thing she ever knew how to do. My father's chair at the kitchen table stayed empty for less than a day, like the air didn't have time to settle before she filled the space with something colder than grief, something sharper than mourning. The morning after we buried him, Linda was already reorganizing the pantry like nothing had happened, lining up cans of soup by expiration date and tossing out anything she didn't like the look of, as if the smell of death hadn't just been inside our walls. She didn't cry, not once. Not during the funeral, not during the wake, not even when I handed her one of Dad's old thermals that still smelled faintly like his cologne and coffee breath. She sniffed, maybe from the dust, maybe from something deeper, but said nothing before folding it neatly and stuffing it in a donation bag like it was nothing more than a rag. The house felt hollow in a way I wasn't ready for, but she filled the silence with noise, drawers slamming, vacuum cleaner humming, her voice cutting through the rooms with to-do lists no one asked for. The walls still echoed with my dad's presence, but she moved fast, like she was scrubbing his memory off the wallpaper before it could stain. In 1 week, she had rearranged the living room, thrown out his recliner, boxed up his books, and put a brand new picture of herself on the mantel, solo, no husband, no frame shared with anyone but herself. If someone had walked in off the street, they'd think he'd never lived here. The first time she called me basement boy, I laughed because I honestly thought she was joking. I was wiping down the kitchen counters after making dinner, pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, just the way Dad liked them, and she looked at me with this expression that was half smirk, half sneer, and said, not every basement boy gets to eat upstairs. Then she chuckled like it was the cleverest damn thing she'd ever said. I stood there for a second, dish towel in my hand, not knowing whether to say something or throw the plate at the wall. But I did what I always did. I swallowed it. I went downstairs. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. That became the rhythm of our days. She'd throw little barbs, and I'd pretend they didn't land. She criticized the way I folded laundry, the temperature I kept the thermostat at, the fact that I didn't use coasters even though I bought the damn coffee table. I'd be fixing the plumbing or hauling groceries in from the car, and she'd mutter things like, well, at least you're useful, or imagine if your father could see this now. And still, I said nothing. Not because I didn't have words, I had plenty, but because I had already learned that saying them would only open a door I didn't know how to close. She acted like she had always been in charge, like she'd just been letting Dad play house for 40 years. And in her mind, Maybe she believed that. Maybe she needed to believe that to keep herself from unraveling. Because the truth was, without Dad around, there was no one left to balance her out. She had the whole stage now, and I was just the understudy she forgot to replace. The ugliest part wasn't what she said out loud, it was how she looked at me, like I was some disappointment she never had the courage to throw out, like I had outstayed my welcome in a house that I, deep down, knew she didn't even legally own. I kept thinking about the deed in the drawer, the quiet power I had tucked away under receipts and utility bills, the truth that could break her if I wanted to. But I didn't want to break her. Not then. I wanted something softer, something stupid and impossible. I wanted her to see me, to remember that I gave up my career, my apartment, my entire sense of independence to take care of a dying father and a woman who never once said thank you. I wanted her to look at me and not see failure or inconvenience, but the person keeping her entire world from falling apart. She never did. And the more I hoped for it, the crueler she became. One night, I heard her on the phone with her friend Susan, one of those women who dresses like she's always on her way to judge a bake-off, and she said, "He's still here. My little permanent roommate." She laughed, called me her house mouse. I was standing outside the door with a basket of her laundry in my arms. I could have dropped it. I could have stormed in and let loose 20 years of swallowed rage. Instead, I just turned and walked away, carrying her clothes down the stairs like a ghost in his own life. That was the moment I started wondering if silence could rot a person from the inside out. Not the kind of silence that's peaceful or stoic, but the kind that eats your spine and steals your voice and makes you forget what it feels like to take up space. I was living like I didn't belong in the house I maintained, paying bills I never missed, watching a woman gaslight me with every little smile and loaded phrase, and still I said nothing. And maybe that was the worst part, not what she said, not what she did, but what I allowed. I let her build her throne out of my obedience, brick by brick, insult by insult. And I stood there, silent, because somewhere deep inside I still thought that maybe, just maybe, being a good son meant taking the hit and not swinging back. But every good son has a breaking point. And mine was getting closer with every "you're lucky we let you stay here" that dripped from her mouth like venom she didn't even taste anymore. It started with the church ladies, those perfectly permed women in floral blouses who wore their judgment like perfume, heavy and clinging to everything. They came every other Sunday after service, walking in like they owned the place, all clucking and smiling and asking questions that sounded polite but felt like thinly veiled interrogations. Linda would offer them coffee she didn't even drink and serve cookies she didn't bake, all while orchestrating the visit like it was a stage production she had been rehearsing for all week. And I was the uncredited extra in the background, setting up chairs, clearing cups, staying out of sight unless summoned for some chore she didn't want to do herself. She introduced me the same way every time, with that sing-song voice and a condescending little laugh. "This is my son, Nathaniel. He never quite flew the nest," she'd say, like it was some kind of joke. Like it was cute that I was nearly 50 and still living at home, as if the word still wasn't doing all the heavy lifting in that sentence. Never once did she say I paid off the mortgage, never mentioned that I covered the taxes, handled every repair, or was the reason the lights stayed on and the fridge stayed full. According to her, I was just still here. I could have spoken up. God knows I wanted to. But the thing about being embarrassed in your own home is that it doesn't feel like rage right away, it feels like drowning. You stand there, smiling politely, nodding while they chuckle at your expense, and you think, maybe this isn't the moment to make a scene. But those moments stack. They gather in the back of your throat like stones you keep swallowing until one day you can't take a breath without choking on the weight of them. The cracks really started showing when she began going through my things, not subtly, not even pretending to have a reason. I'd come home from work and find drawers left open that I knew I'd closed, paperwork slightly out of place, laundry I hadn't sorted yet mysteriously folded and placed on my bed. I asked her once if she had been in my room, and she said, Well, it's not like it's your space. When I asked what the hell that meant, she smiled and said, "Guests don't get opinions, Nate." She said it like it was gospel, like she'd read it in some twisted Proverbs knockoff meant for mothers who thought boundary crossing was just part of the parenting package. I stood there, stunned. Not because I didn't see it coming, I did, but because she finally said it out loud, the thing she had been implying for years. I wasn't a man in his own home. I was a guest. A tolerated inconvenience. A grown child she could lord over with a look and a passive-aggressive Bible verse. I started locking my door when I left for work, not because I thought she'd steal anything, she didn't want my stuff, but because I needed to feel like there was some space she couldn't violate. That didn't last long. One Wednesday afternoon, I came home and found her standing on the front porch, chatting with the locksmith like they were discussing the weather. I pulled into the driveway and got out of the car slow, too calm, too quiet, because something in me knew this wasn't just a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was war, plain and simple. "New locks," she said, smiling like it was a joke. "The front door's been sticking. Figured I'd take care of it while you were gone." I asked her who called the locksmith. She said she did. I asked her whose name the house was in. She didn't answer. I asked the locksmith, a kid who looked barely 20, if he knew he was changing locks on a house without the owner's permission. He stammered something, glanced between us, and looked like he wanted to vanish into his toolbox. I told him to pack it up and go, that I'd be contacting the company. He left, flustered, and Linda just stood there with that tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're being dramatic," she said, arms folded like she was disappointed in me. "I was just trying to help. This house needs maintenance, Nate. You wouldn't understand because you've never owned anything real." That was the moment. Right there. When something inside me cracked. Not completely, not yet, but just enough to let something cold and final slip through. I didn't yell. I didn't break anything. I just stared at her and said, "You need to stop pretending this house is yours." And then I walked inside and locked the door behind me. She stood out there for a few minutes, probably expecting me to come back out and apologize, to take it all back like I always had. But I didn't. I stayed behind that door, hands shaking, heart pounding, thinking about all the years I'd spent pretending that being patient made me strong. That turning the other cheek made me good. That staying silent was noble. But what if silence was just cowardice with better PR? What if all these years I wasn't being strong or kind, I was just afraid? Afraid of becoming the bad guy. Afraid of making her angry. Afraid that once I said what I really thought, there'd be no going back, no forgiveness, no family left at all. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about the key in my pocket and the deed in my drawer. I thought about how far she was willing to go to make sure I never forgot who she thought this house belonged to. But the locks? That was her mistake. That was the first real swing she took. And from that moment on, I wasn't going to keep my guard down anymore. Because guests don't get opinions. But homeowners? They get the last word. It started with the folder, thick, worn, unmarked on the outside, but inside, every page told a truth nobody else seemed to care about. It wasn't flashy, didn't have tabs or color-coded dividers, just a cheap manila shell packed with receipts, tax documents, utility bills, and renewal notices going back more than 15 years. All of them were in my name. Every electric bill, every property tax statement, every home insurance policy, every check stub from the company that installed the new boiler when the old one finally gave out during a brutal January freeze. I kept it in the bottom drawer of my dresser, tucked under a couple of ratty old t-shirts I never wore but never threw out. I labeled the folder just in case in black Sharpie one night, after a particularly bitter fight about how much she sacrificed for me. It wasn't a plan, at least not at first. It was survival. Because I knew, even if nobody else did, that at some point she was going to push too far, and when she did, I wanted to be ready. Not with fists or screaming matches, but with facts cold and clean and impossible to spin. That folder was my insurance policy, my silent scream, my proof that I hadn't imagined everything, that I hadn't just been some freeloading failure living in mommy's basement like she liked to imply. Linda had a talent for rewriting history in real time. She could take something you both remembered clearly and twist it so subtly that you started doubting your own memory, questioning your own gut. She'd look you dead in the eye and say, "That never happened," even if you had the bruises or the bank statements or the emotional wreckage to prove it. She was surgical with her guilt, sharp with it, like a scalpel. Never obvious. Never loud. Just 1,000 tiny cuts, delivered with a smile and a cup of coffee. "You wouldn't have made it without us," she told me once, during one of those long, drawn-out arguments that started over something dumb. This one was about a new couch I bought without asking her. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, eyes narrowed, and said, "After all we've done for you, the least you could do is show some respect." I didn't respond right away. I just sat there, sinking deeper into the cushions she claimed were too modern for her classic tastes, and tried to figure out what exactly it was she thought she'd done for me. Let me be clear, I didn't have a bad childhood. I wasn't beaten. I wasn't starved. But love in our house always had conditions, and praise came with an invoice. Every lunch packed, every ride given, every dollar spent on clothes or college was logged somewhere in her invisible ledger, waiting for the day she'd slap it down like a bill and say, "You owe me." And maybe that's what hurt the most. That it wasn't enough to simply love each other. There had to be a transaction. A price. A weight you carried, even if you never asked for it. That's what she meant when she started bringing up power of attorney. It didn't come out of nowhere. She'd watched a documentary or read something in the church newsletter about aging mothers being taken advantage of, and suddenly she was tossing the phrase around like it was no big deal. "It's just a precaution," she said one morning over scrambled eggs I cooked. "In case something happens. It'll make things easier if I need help managing things." I asked her what things she meant, and she waved it off like I was being paranoid. But I wasn't paranoid. I knew her better than anyone. I knew she didn't ask unless she had already decided she was entitled to whatever it was. I told her no. Flat out. No softening. No, maybe later. Just a hard, cold no. And the look she gave me in that moment? It was the closest I've ever seen her come to actual shock. Like she truly believed I'd hand over control without blinking. Like she thought she still had that much power over me. She dropped the sweet act right then. Didn't yell. Didn't cry. Just looked at me with ice in her voice and said, "After all we've done for you." I remember those words because they weren't just a guilt trip. They were a threat, a reminder, a pulling of the invisible strings she thought still tethered me to her version of the truth. But by then, I had the folder. I had the bills. I had the deed. I had years of quiet sacrifice turned into paper trails she couldn't erase. And for the first time, I started to realize that maybe I hadn't stayed silent out of fear. Maybe I had stayed silent because I was building something, brick by brick, page by page. A record of everything I'd carried, everything I'd paid for, everything I had done, not for recognition, not even for justice, but so that when the day finally came, I could open that drawer and say, "Here's the truth. All of it. You don't get to lie your way through this one. Because love that comes with a bill isn't love. It's a contract. And the thing about contracts is, once one party breaks it, the other one is free." So, maybe I was starting to believe I didn't owe her a damn thing anymore. Maybe I never did. Maybe I was just the one who finally realized the rent had already been paid, in full, in silence, in years I'd never get back. It was one of those rainy Thursdays where the sky never fully brightens, just shifts from gray to darker gray, and everything outside feels soaked in a kind of quiet dread before anything even happens. I had spent most of the afternoon replacing a sump pump in the basement because the storm was supposed to last all weekend, and I was trying to stay ahead of the water damage we couldn't afford. By the time I dragged myself upstairs, cold and dripping, the living room lights were too bright and too warm, the smell of cinnamon tea and store-bought cookies hovering like a trap. Linda was sitting on the edge of the recliner she never let me sit in, chatting with my cousin Riley and her church friend, that same nosy woman, Susan, who wore more perfume than a Vegas hotel lobby and always had a half smile like she'd just been fed gossip. They stopped talking the moment I walked in, that familiar hush of people pretending they weren't just discussing you seconds ago. I should have walked away. I should have gone back downstairs and pretended I didn't exist, the way I'd trained myself to do for years. But I didn't. Not this time. I nodded at them and went to the kitchen to grab a drink. As I passed through the doorway, I heard Linda's voice carry across the room like a dart. "Well, of course the money's missing," she said, loud enough to make sure I heard every word. "He's the only one who touches my things." I stopped dead in my tracks, one hand still on the fridge door, the other clenched so tight I felt my own fingernails digging into my palm. Riley said something low and awkward, maybe trying to laugh it off or change the subject, but Linda wasn't finished. "Don't look at me like that," she continued, and now she was looking at me, eyes narrowed, chin tilted. "He's always had access to my purse, my mail. It wouldn't be hard for him to skim something off the top. And I mean, when someone's not contributing, they start to feel entitled." That last word hit me like a punch to the gut, not because it was the worst thing she'd ever said, but because she knew what it meant, and she knew what it would do to me in front of those two women. My cousin just stared at the floor, trying to disappear into the rug, and Susan just raised her eyebrows like she'd finally been handed the scandal she'd always suspected. I didn't say anything. Not then. I just stood there in the kitchen, heart pounding, vision blurring at the edges, knowing damn well that arguing wouldn't help. Arguing meant playing her game. Arguing would give her the one thing she craved more than control, an audience. So I left. I walked out the front door into the rain, didn't grab a jacket, didn't even think. I walked around the block, past the flickering streetlights and wet lawns, trying to keep my fury from boiling over into something I couldn't walk back. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just kept walking until the cold finally bit through my clothes and reminded me that I still had a body, still had some control left over what I did next. When I got home, the house was quiet. Riley and Susan were gone, thank God. Linda was in the kitchen, washing dishes like nothing happened, humming that damn hymn she always defaulted to when she wanted to seem innocent. I didn't say anything as I walked past her. I went to my room, pulled open the drawer, took out the folder, the one labeled just in case. And then, with hands that didn't shake nearly as much as I thought they would, I took out the deed. I walked into that kitchen, dropped it on the table in front of her, and sat down. She didn't look up at first. Just kept scrubbing a plate like the water was gonna wash away what she said earlier. "You're lucky," she said finally, not looking at me, not pausing the motion of her sponge, "that we let you stay here after everything. Most mothers would have asked you to leave by now." I took a deep breath, let it out slow. Then I said it, clear and cold and without an ounce of apology. "Actually, Mom, you've been staying with me." She froze. Didn't turn around. Didn't speak. I pushed the deed across the table with 2 fingers so it made that soft sliding sound on the formica, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else is too quiet. "That's your name?" I asked, knowing damn well it wasn't. "No? Thought so." Still, she said nothing. She just stood there, the plate still in her hand, the water still running. I almost expected her to crack a joke or laugh it off or accuse me of forging it. But all she did was set the dish down carefully, slowly, and turn off the faucet. The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was war without noise. It was all the screaming we never did, all the resentment we'd let ferment until it turned into something poisonous and permanent. It was the sound of a line being drawn in a house that had already split in 2. And I wish I could tell you that moment felt good. That it felt like victory. But it didn't. It felt like putting down a dog you'd raised since it was a puppy, necessary, maybe, but gut-wrenching all the same. Because even when someone's awful, even when they've hurt you again and again, a part of you still wants to be loved by them. That part of me died a little in that kitchen. I stood up, left the papers where they were, and walked away without waiting for her reaction. I didn't need her to cry. I didn't need her to apologize. I just needed the truth to be said, out loud, finally, so I could stop pretending the person I was living with was my mother and not some ghost who had been haunting me with guilt and ownership for half my life. And once the truth is spoken, you can't pretend anymore. The masks don't fit. The scripts fall apart. All that's left is silence and what comes next. The first few days after I laid the deed on the table were thick with a silence that didn't feel like peace, not even close, but more like a tight, invisible rope stretched between us, ready to snap if either of us breathed too loudly. Linda didn't yell. She didn't cry. She didn't throw the papers back at me or call a lawyer or demand to see a notary. She just stopped. She shut down like a circuit breaker tripped in her chest, and for a moment I thought maybe I had broken something in her that couldn't be put back together. She didn't speak to me at all for the first 2 days, not a word, not even a glance if she could help it. She cooked for herself, cleaned only her side of the fridge, started putting her coffee creamer in a little insulated bag in the back so I wouldn't accidentally use it. It was like she'd officially downgraded me from useless live-in child to hostile invader, and the walls of the house became a kind of neutral zone between enemy territories. Still, she didn't leave. She started packing little things, photo frames, knickknacks from her church friends, that old china teapot she never used but always displayed, and left them in boxes by her bedroom door. But the boxes never moved. They just sat there, gathering dust and daring me to ask what her plan was. I didn't ask. And she didn't explain. Instead, she started calling people. Quietly at first, like a whisper campaign in slow motion. My Aunt Marie called me out of the blue one evening, her voice tight with forced politeness, asking if I was okay and if it was true that I'd forced Mom to give up the house. I told her I didn't force anything, that Dad had left it to me legally, before he died. I told her I'd been paying the bills for over a decade. I told her the truth, plain and simple. She didn't believe me. Or maybe she did, but it was easier not to. Because Linda had already gotten to her. Linda had always been good at that, framing herself as the victim before anyone else had time to ask questions. She told our cousins that I'd manipulated Dad when he was sick. She told her friends at church that I was trying to sell the house out from under her. She told anyone who'd listened that I had turned on her after all she'd done for me. And sure, not everyone believed her, but enough did that I started getting strange looks at the grocery store and sideways glances at the gas station. This town isn't big, and news like that, especially scandal-laced in family drama, spreads like gasoline on dry leaves. But I didn't back down. I changed the locks the following week, had the guy come early in the morning while she was out walking. When she came home and the key didn't work, I opened the door, handed her the new one, and said nothing. She didn't ask why. She knew. I started repainting rooms, soft greens and blues to replace the beige she'd always insisted on. I bought a new recliner and dragged the couch she loved so much into the garage. I stopped tiptoeing through the house like a guest and started walking like a man who knew every nail in the floorboards. And yes, I invited people over. Not often, not loud, but enough to remind her and myself that I didn't need permission anymore. A couple of old buddies from work came by to help me clean out the shed. My friend Mark brought over a pizza one Friday night, and we watched the game in the living room like normal people do. She stayed in her room, of course, probably listening through the wall, cataloging every sound like a betrayal. But she didn't come out. Not once. That was the new game. Not words. Not accusations. Just silence. Cold, weaponized silence that hung in the air like static. It followed me from room to room, curled up next to me on the couch, sat across from me at the dinner table. Sometimes I'd hear her on the phone in her room, whispering about me like I wasn't a floor away. Other times I'd catch her watching me from the hallway, her expression unreadable, like she was trying to solve a riddle that used to be her son. And the thing is, I missed her. Not the woman she'd become, not the cold manipulator with a martyr complex and a memory that conveniently edited every sacrifice I ever made. But I missed the version of her I used to believe in. The one who kissed my scraped knees and taught me how to tie my shoes and stood beside me when I built my first birdhouse in the garage. That version had been gone a long time, I knew that now, but I still mourned her like a ghost that only I could see. You ever win an argument and feel worse afterward? That's what this was. The truth was out. The house was mine. The power had shifted. But now I lived with a woman who hated me and couldn't leave, and the silence between us stretched longer every day. I ate alone. She did laundry at night. We passed like shadows in a shared tomb, each too proud to admit the damage was permanent. Freedom came with a price. Not regret, not exactly, but a loneliness that settled into my bones, the kind you can't drink or sleep away. Because when you finally stand up to someone who's been controlling you your whole life, they don't just lose power, you lose whatever love you thought you had. Or maybe you realize it wasn't love at all, just obedience dressed in something softer. And so the house stayed full, but empty. The walls still held both our stories, but now they told them in two separate voices that never met in the middle. The fallout wasn't fire or fury. It was colder than that. It was two people refusing to blink. And only one of us had the keys. 2 years passed slower than I ever thought time could move, not in some dramatic, cinematic way, but in that slow-drip manner of ordinary days repeating themselves under the weight of unresolved tension where nothing truly burns down. But nothing ever rebuilds either. The house didn't change much from the outside. The lawn was still trimmed, the mailbox still painted white, the same old wind chime hanging on the porch, but inside, things were different. Things had quietly rearranged themselves like a room left too long in shadow. Linda lived in the guest room now, literally, not symbolically, not emotionally, but physically, the room she used to save for out-of-town cousins or people from the church choir who needed a place to crash after a holiday service. She moved in there on her own terms, of course, said she wanted some space from all the noise I made, even though I barely made any. The move wasn't announced, and I didn't ask questions. She packed a few boxes, took her clothes and that little wooden crucifix from above her bed, and one night she just didn't sleep in her old room anymore. I didn't stop her. I didn't help either. And so she stayed. The shift was quiet but undeniable. She had gone from self-declared owner to permanent occupant of a room meant for people passing through. And yet she never spoke about leaving. She never asked about moving somewhere else, never hinted at finding an apartment or a home or a facility. She just existed, like a tenant who never signed a lease but refuses to go, even when the walls start folding in. Her health started slipping sometime around the second winter. Subtle at first, forgetting groceries, mixing up dates, struggling with the stairs more than usual. I offered help, gently, practically, the way I knew she hated the most, because it reminded her that she wasn't the one in charge anymore. She refused at first. Said she was just tired. Said I shouldn't make such a fuss. But eventually, the body wins over pride, and I started doing the grocery runs, started prepping meals she used to critique and now accepted in silence. I drove her to the doctor when she couldn't see the road clearly, picked up prescriptions without being asked. Not because she deserved it, but because I couldn't not do it. You grow up with someone, no matter how sharp they get, and some part of you still remembers who they were before everything broke. But the warmth? That was gone. Evaporated like it had never been there in the first place. We didn't have conversations anymore, not really, just exchanges of necessity. Her voice lost its edge, but also its depth, like she'd burned through all her anger and had nothing left but smoke. She watched the TV at low volume. Read the Bible more. Rarely called anyone. The woman who once lived to host people, to control rooms with a smile, now sat in her chair by the window, barely moving, barely speaking. One night, while I was rinsing dishes, she cleared her throat and said something I hadn't heard from her in months. "Nate, can we talk?" I dried my hands and sat across from her at the kitchen table, same spot where I had dropped the deed 2 years ago. She looked tired, not in a dramatic way, just worn down like an old lamp that used to shine brighter than it had any right to. "I was thinking," she started, her fingers fiddling with the corner of a napkin, "about the house. Just in case something happens to you, maybe we should put my name back on it." She said it like it was logical, like it was fair, like the last 20 years of erosion hadn't happened and we could just rewind the clock to some imaginary middle where things were still salvageable. She didn't ask to take it from me, not directly. She just wanted back on the deed, as if the name had ever truly been hers in the first place. I looked at her, quiet for a long time. And then I smiled. Not cruelly, not kindly. Just enough to say, "I see what you're doing and I'm not doing it anymore." And I said nothing. I stood up, rinsed my cup, and left the table. She didn't bring it up again. That's the thing about endings. They don't always crash or scream or break the furniture. Sometimes they just slip into the room, change the locks again, and leave both of you sitting in different corners of the same house wondering what you're still holding on to. She stayed in the guest room. I stopped waiting for an apology. We passed each other in the hallway like two actors between scenes, both still wearing the costumes of people we used to be. I still took care of her. Made sure the bills were paid. Kept the heat on when her joints ached. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't cold. But I was done trying to repair something she never admitted she broke. Done begging her to see me. Done carrying the weight of a love I now knew had strings attached to every heartbeat. Some nights I'd stand on the porch, beer in hand, staring at the way the sky swallowed the sun inch by inch, wondering what exactly I had done here. Had I stood up for myself, or just cut the final thread to the last person who was ever supposed to love me unconditionally? Had I protected what was mine, or had I buried something human under all the silence and control? I didn't know. I still don't. All I knew was, the house was finally quiet. No more accusations. No more staged gossip sessions in the living room. No more passive-aggressive sermons disguised as small talk. Just a house. Just two people. Just the space between them growing wider every year. Sometimes justice doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it's just one key in your hand. And one door you never have to knock on again.